At 9:17 on the morning of January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George sat alone inside the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz on Guadalcanal. He was surrounded by a suffocating stillness that did not resemble peace so much as anticipation. He had no radioman whispering coordinates, no spotter tracing invisible wind, no comforting presence of another human being. All he had was a bolt-action Winchester Model 70, a dented canteen, and 60 carefully hoarded rounds of .30-06 ammunition he had packed months earlier in Tennessee. Over the previous 72 hours, Japanese snipers had killed 14 men from his battalion. Somewhere in the hierarchy above him, a commanding officer had dismissed George's cherished rifle as an indulgence better suited for deer than war. What happens over the next 4 days will silence the snipers, stun his battalion, and permanently erase the idea that his rifle was a toy. John George was 27 years old, an Illinois state champion marksman whose reputation for long-range precision was better known on rifle ranges than battlefields. Despite all that skill he carried into combat, the statistical absurdity of 0 confirmed kills. When George first unpacked his Winchester at Camp Forest, the armorer looked at the polished walnut stock with a raised eyebrow. One would think someone had smuggled a ballroom instrument into an artillery park. The armorer asked, half smiling, whether the rifle was meant for deer or Germans, and George answered without irritation that it was for the Japanese. The response earned amusement rather than respect because the Army believed deeply in standardization, in the idea that war was best fought with identical weapons issued to everyone. Captain Morris ordered George to carry the regulation M1 Garand, the semi-automatic rifle that symbolized modern American firepower. George listened politely, nodded appropriately, and kept carrying the Winchester anyway. That rifle represented 2 years of National Guard pay and thousands of rounds fired in disciplined practice. Fitted with a Lyman Alaskan scope, the rifle sacrificed magazine capacity for something George valued more: complete confidence in where each shot would land. Long before the war, George had built a reputation that seemed almost excessive for a young man. In 1939, he became the youngest winner of the Illinois State Championship at 1,000 yards. His groups were so tight they drew attention even among seasoned competitors. Those accomplishments, which were honestly impressive on paper, did little to impress officers who believed battlefield effectiveness came from doctrine and volume of fire rather than individual mastery. By late December 1942, George's battalion relieved Marines who had endured months of brutal fighting to hold Henderson Field. The groves west of the Matanicow River were still contested, but not in the way soldiers expected. Japanese snipers had climbed high into banyan and palm trees and had somehow turned the jungle into a deadly vertical maze where danger came from above without warning. Men died filling canteens, walking patrols, revisiting trails they had crossed safely hours before. By January 21st, the toll had become intolerable, and that evening, the battalion commander summoned George with a question that mingled desperation and disbelief. Could the much-mocked mail-order rifle actually make a difference? George answered with credentials rather than bravado. The commander granted him until morning. That night, George could barely sleep. He spent the night cleaning the Winchester with the steady, familiar motions of someone preparing for a test that allowed no mistakes. At dawn, he slipped into the rubble of a ruined bunker, arranged his ammunition, settled behind the rifle, and began scanning through the scope. At 9:17, a small detail caught his attention. A branch moved against windless air, 87 feet up. George adjusted his aim, slowed his breathing, and squeezed the trigger. The sniper fell. George did not move. Japanese snipers often worked in pairs. At 9:43, another figure appeared, descending a nearby tree. George fired again. The second sniper tumbled through branches, his rifle clattering behind him. Late that morning, a bullet slammed into a sandbag inches from George's head, spraying dirt across his face. He froze, waited, then calmly searched for the source. At 11:38, he spotted the third sniper attempting to reposition. George fired. By noon, 5 snipers were dead. On January 24th, George chose unpredictability, moving to an abandoned Marine machine gun nest among rocks. At 8:17, he spotted a sniper positioned unusually low in a palm tree. The placement felt wrong, too easy. Instead of firing, George widened his search. He found the real sniper hidden in a distant banyan, waiting for him to take the bait. George fired twice. 10 snipers were now dead. Machine gun fire tore into the rocks he had just vacated. At 9:47, George noticed something different. The final sniper was moving along the ground. Submerged in a water-filled crater, George waited as the sniper approached, signaled to a hidden partner, and began a cautious sweep. Knowing he could not safely engage them one at a time, George slipped beneath the muddy water and waited. When the 2 soldiers passed with their backs exposed, George rose silently and fired. 11 snipers, 11 shots. Things looked like they were going great. That is, until a Japanese recovery patrol followed George's tracks back to the crater. When a soldier appeared at the rim, George fired from concealment. 3 enemy soldiers fell before George escaped under chaotic rifle fire and made his way back to American lines with 2 rounds remaining. When George got back to the battalion, he had to give the captain a debrief. Captain Morris listened without interruption as George reported 11 sniper kills across 4 days and 3 additional infantry casualties during escape. Questions about ammunition and rifle condition replaced the sarcasm that seemed to always come out whenever his rifle was the topic of conversation. As a matter of fact, that afternoon Colonel Ferry asked whether George could train others in the disciplines that had turned a sporting rifle into an instrument of strategic consequence. George agreed on one condition: he would keep the Winchester. Approval came almost immediately after. What John George proved at Point Cruz had very little to do with civilian rifles versus military rifles. His story was really about the difference between standardization and mastery, between carrying equipment and truly understanding it, between following doctrine and knowing when experience gives you permission to bend it. The battalion had better weapons on paper, more firepower, more men, yet it required one officer with an unfashionable rifle and extraordinary patience to solve a problem that had been bleeding them for days. George later trained the Army's first sniper elements in the Pacific, fought with Merrill's Marauders, survived wounds, earned decorations, and after the war, studied at Princeton and Oxford before entering public service. In 1947, he published Shots Fired in Anger, which is a work still honored for its clinical clarity.